Good evening. A very warm welcome to the first lecture of the General Society Labour, Literature and Landmark Lecture Series. I am Karen Taylor, Programme Director of the General Society. The Labour, Literature and Landmark Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, and if you don't mind, I'm going to ask, how many of you here this evening would this be your first visit? Okay, right, well, a warm welcome and also, of course, a welcome back to previous attendees. The General Society was founded in 1785 by 22 artisans. Today, our 234-year-old organization continues to serve the people of the city of New York. We do this through our cultural and educational programs. They include our lecture series, of which, of course, tonight's lecture is part of, our General Society Library, which will be celebrating 200 years next year, our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and the John M. Mossman Lock Collection, which you are welcome to visit after our talk this evening, and that is upstairs. You will find more information on the blue and white postcard on your seats. Now, we have such a wonderful start to this year's lecture season, and we have the pleasure of welcoming critically acclaimed biographer Susan Ronald, who tonight will discuss her biography of Conde Nast, the publishing legend of Vogue and Vanity Fair and other illustrious publications. I also want to mention, if you've not already done so, you will have an opportunity to purchase this wonderful book with its absolutely stunning cover later this evening. So please be aware that you have this opportunity, and I'm sure Susan would be happy to sign the book for you. I also want to mention that C-SPAN are also filming this talk tonight, so this program will also be rebroadcast on Book TV. And when we do get to the Q&A portion, I want to remind you that anyone who's asking a question, that you will also have the opportunity to be featured on Book TV. Born and raised in the United States, Miss Ronald has lived in England for more than 25 years and has come over especially this week to talk about her book. She is the author of A Dangerous Woman, Hitler's Art Thief, Heretic Queen, The Pirate Queen, and Shakespeare's Daughter. It is my considerable pleasure to introduce to you Susan Ronald.
Thank you, everybody. I just hope that our technical problems are at an end. So you may see the little dots there on the bottom. I decided to write about Condé Nast really because I tend to write about power and greed. All of the people I've written about before, there's another book which isn't on here, have been very powerful people. Some of them have been greedy. Almost all of them have had some sort of a brush with the law. But after A Dangerous Woman, about Florence Gould, who was married to the youngest son of Jay Gould, who many of you will certainly know of, I decided that having written about someone who was incredibly powerful, incredibly devious, and also the banker to Hermann Goering by the end of the war, and never, ever was tried for her dastardly deeds, I needed to cleanse myself. I wanted to write about a really good person. So I told this to my agent and my publisher, and they just kind of looked blankly at me, and they go, well, you write about power and greed. How could you write about a nice person? It was my agent who suggested that I have a look at the publishing industry. And I go, are there any good guys in publishing? And sure enough, he was right. So I decided that I was going to write a book about one of the most powerful people at the turn of the century, and then going into World War II, Conde Nast. Now, of course, a lot of you know all of the various Nast magazines, but they weren't all there at the beginning. And I'd like to take you through what made Condé Nast Condé Nast. There are a number of fortuitous circumstances, but mostly, and I apologize for the quality of some of these photographs, there was his mother, who's pictured on the right here. Unfortunately, I don't have her as a young woman. This is the only picture that the family still has in their possession. She was quite a lady in her own right. Her father was a guy called Louis Benoit, and he settled in St. Louis in this lovely home here. He was married 3 times and had 15 children. And he was extremely wealthy. He actually was a banker, apparently a good guy. I know that doesn't exactly go with the term banker, but we'll, go with me on this, okay? And he left several million dollars to his children when he died. Condé, as a child, remembers playing in his maternal grandfather's bedroom here. And it's currently still a historic house on the outskirts of St. Louis, mostly as a wedding venue today. But of course, Esther, his mother, only inherited $300,000 by the time the money came down to her. Now, on his father's side, his grandfather, Wilhelm Nast, was born in Stuttgart in Germany, emigrated to the United States as a teacher, but was always a sort of depressive kind of a chap, very serious. But he converted to Methodism, and he became known as the father of German Methodism in North America. His eldest son, William, was a man who wanted to be born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but the family didn't have any. So he decided that he was going to go off to Germany as the American consul to Germany and buy himself a neat uniform so he could hobnob with all of the royals. His father was absolutely beside himself. And naturally, William Nast fell on very, very hard times because he also stole money from American citizens while he was there. So he left Germany very quickly under a cloud and took a number of odd jobs and somehow met up with Esther Benoit in New York City. Condé was the eldest son. He had another brother, Louis, who was a great pianist. But Condé grew up essentially without a father. At the age of 3, William Nast decided he was going back to Europe to make his fortune. Actually, it was more like hard work was only for suckers. So Condé was actually the man of the family. He had 2 younger sisters as well who were what they called new women. Now, new women were women who made their own rules, who didn't hang around with chaperones before the turn of the 20th century, who actually were extremely independent. And so was his mother. She had to be, to keep the family together. But of course, as the years went on, his father stayed away until Condé was 17. Things got pretty tough in the end. And the only Nast member of the family that stayed close to them was his Aunt Fanny, who was William Nast's younger sister. Now, Fanny was actually quite a gal herself. She married into money. She loved fine things. She was very stylish in her own way, and considering that this picture is taken in the 1880s, you can see that she did like to look nice. What is amazing is that she married into the Gamble family of Procter & Gamble fame. So she decided that she was going to help out poor Esther to get her sons to an American college that would set them on their way. The only problem is when she went to visit, Louis apparently was very untidy. He reminded her a great deal of her brother, who of course had abandoned the family, and therefore she decided she would only send Condé to Georgetown University. Louis never spoke to his brother again. So here is Condé as he graduated. He was a very handsome young man. His best friend at college was Bob Collier. And Bob Collier was, of course, the heir to the Collier Library. He went off for a year to Europe, to England, to Oxford, came back, and his father said, "I'm going to give you Collier's Weekly because it's failing." They only had something like $1,000 worth of advertising at the time that he gave the weekly over to Bob. And Bob had done a lot of work with Condé at various clubs at Georgetown. And he went down to St. Louis and talked Condé into accepting a $12 a week job with him, which he did, considering that he was the man of the family at that point. Fortunately, Condé's father had died, so he was no longer a drain on the family. And the two of them worked together very, very happily indeed for about 15 years. Now, Bob Collier, pictured left here, was an innovator. And he thought about making Collier's less of a generalized magazine, but with Condé pushing him and saying, now look, we can really sell advertising if we decide that we're going to create special issues. So you saw before that the other picture that I just showed you was a Remington issue, Frederick Remington's art. This was the issue that started the Gibson girls going in terms of Collier's magazine. He overpaid Gibson, by the way, double of what he would normally get at Ladies' Home Journal so that he could have him exclusively for a period of 2 years. And that was something that Condé learned about as well. Bob Collier was also very into navigation. His great friend was Orville Wright, who's on the right here. And together with Condé, they set up the first ever national national magazine company that had its own sales network in every major city across America. Condé understood that to sell magazines, you had to make sure that your customer wanted to read the ads that were in it, first of all, that your advertiser had to feel that he wasn't wasting his money advertising, and also that you were something called ethical in what you sold. Now, this was the era of quack medicines. Almost every newspaper promised to give you something special to cure catarrh. I mean, I don't think I'd really want to have any swamp root. I don't know about you, but I think that that's pretty bad. But this product called Peruna claimed that it could cure absolutely anything. So Collier's joined with, believe it or not, Ladies' Home Journal to stop quack medicine advertising. They believed it was killing Americans. This is just a few other of the ads at the time. You can have your diabetes readily cured, which the Vin Urbain Pesqui will strengthen your system, assuage your thirst, and rapidly decreases your sugar and prevents diabetic shock. Wonderful. Well, we won't go into Dr. Bandit's products now, will we? Okay. Now, you wouldn't believe it or not, but C.W. Post, who founded Post Cereals and Postum, was another one of the people who was selling his cereals as a medicine. Here's to another year and years of steady nerves, clear brains, and vigorous health. Well, Bob Collier, kind of spurred on by Condé, decided that he was going to sue old C.W., and he did, and he won. So Condé learned a great deal from his relationship with Bob. Not only that, but Bob introduced him to his first wife, Clarice Couder. Now, I don't know if any of you remember the legal firm called Couder Brothers here in New York City. They had their offices on Fifth Avenue for many, many years. But the Couder family came across to America at the behest of the Marquis de Lafayette, George Washington's friend. They established themselves as international lawyers in America in the early 19th century. And Clarice was part of New York's 400. Condé was by now a wealthy man by 1902 when he married her. He was earning about $40,000 a year. The only person in America earning more at that time was Theodore Roosevelt as president. He earned $50,000. So she decided that she loved Bob Collier, but Bob Collier didn't love her. So Condé was a good second from her point of view. He wasn't after her money. He understood that she held the whip hand as far as society was concerned. The only problem is Condé understood that society was changing. Women were changing. Their role was changing. They wanted to become independent. They wanted the vote. They wanted their thoughts to be recognized. And while certainly Clarice felt that was for her too, She didn't really like the idea of working for a living because that was beneath a member of the 400 on the social register. Instead, after 2 years of marriage, where she had 2 children, Collier, who was the son first, and then Natika, the daughter, she decided she was going to go off to Paris and become a soprano in Winnaretta Singer's salon in Paris. Of course, she would, because her 3 sisters lived there as well. One of them had been supporting the artist Auguste Rodin as his moneymaker, basically, for the previous 20 years. Now, that isn't very good for a marriage, obviously. Condé decided in 1904 that he was going to set up on his own. Yes, Bob Collier was paying him more money than he was worth. There was no doubt about it. $40,000 a year in those days was close on $1 million. But essentially, he decided that he was going to take a plunge into women's fashion. Now, you'd say, why women's fashion? Here he is at a national magazine. They're starting to go into the niche markets. Condé had decided that women's fashion was going to be key to the changing role of women. Now, up until now, women's fashions, in terms of the clothing that would be put into patterns, had 2 distinct shortcomings. The first, of course, was that all patterns were giveaways alongside fabrics. The second, which was even more incredible, was the fact that there was only one size. And Condé decided, the new woman has many sizes. I'm going to empower her. I'm going to empower women without money to make their own clothing in all the sizes that they come in, and that they should discard their corsets, enjoy life, and be women. And of course, he was right. And he ended up allowing Ladies' Home Journal to own label his home patterns. So Home Pattern Company was his first company. He was still working for Bob Collier, but due to a number of circumstances, he ended up leaving in 1906. 1907, it was the first time he tried to buy Vogue, but he failed. He went across to Europe at that point to rescue his 2 children from Paris and his wife. She decided that she wanted to stay on. And so they went across, picked up the children and the nursemaid. Clarice decided that she would come home too. But then in 1909, he bought Vogue. And Clarice disappeared again for 6 months. Nobody in the family knows why, but she did. He was lucky enough to buy Vogue, sadly, because its owner at that time, a guy called Arthur Turner, who was part of Grollier's, which was a big club at the time for publishers. He had set it up very early on in 1895. And he had hired on a lady at that point as a mail clerk on the left. Her name is Edna Woolman Chase. By the time you see her on the right, she had been the editor of Vogue, or the editor-in-chief in Vogue, for over 50 years. Condé kept her on, obviously. It was Turner's sister who had been the actual editor at the time that he bought it, and she basically left due to a disagreement over some money. In 1912, he decides he's buying 2 more magazines and puts them into one, something called House and Garden. I think a few of you have heard of that one too. So now he has Home Pattern, Vogue, House and Garden. We're only 1912. By 1914, he decides he'd really like to set up an international magazine empire dedicated to women and women's fashion. Unfortunately, there's something called World War I, which began in Europe in 1914. For America, it began in 1917. Edna Woolman Chase comes up to Condé and she says, I've got this wonderful idea. I know we're cut off from French fashions. I know we're cut off from the British men's fashions as well because of the war. But why don't we have something called a charity fashion show, and I'll get all of the New York 400 involved. And Condé was very skeptical. He said, it smacks of trade. I mean, Clarice doesn't like working. Can you imagine these women working on a charity fashion show? She said, give me a chance. And of course, she made it a success. She went to Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, whose name was Mamie, and was able to talk her into creating this fashion show. Mamie immediately telephoned Mrs. Astor, It was a done deal. The only problem was, and it was arranged to be at the Ritz-Carlton in New York, the only problem was all of the models for all of the fashions previously were tied to various fashion houses in Europe, not in America. But Mrs. Astor and Mrs. Fish were able to cobble together a very interesting show of New York fashion. Don't laugh. Here it is. The New York City Public Library just found some of the stills, and if you go to their website, you'll see the fashions. As I said, the models were tied to other places, and as you can see, fortunately, Condé was making clothes in different sizes, because not all of them were models, were they? So there's more of these apparently at the New York City Public Library, and I thought it'd be really interesting to see. Anyway, this upset another gentleman called William Randolph Hearst, who had just bought Harper's Bazaar. And he set his people out to badmouth Vogue and Conde Nast as people who wanted to get rid of European fashion and not import it to America anymore. And they were only out to support New York clothing designers, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what happened, though, was Condé's representative arrived in Paris during the war with a big fat check for the seamstresses who'd been put out of work. So Hearst lost the first round, but he wasn't going to give up. We all know he never did that. Come 1915, two things happened. The most important one was a lunch with the gentleman who founded the coffee house in this building, Frank Crowninshield. Frank was a great aficionado of modern art. He was everybody's favorite raconteur. He had miles and acres of friends throughout New York City. And Condé had lunch with him, probably at the coffee house, actually. I don't know where exactly. And he said, I've got a problem. I've bought two magazines called Dress and Vanity Fair. I've tried to edit them myself, but I'm a publisher. I'm not an editor. What do you think I'm getting wrong? And Frank said, well, it's very simple. You have to make it fizzle. You have to make it a cocktail party where every time somebody turns the page, they're actually joining you in a conversation. They're actually understanding what it is that everybody in society or everybody who we read about is thinking about. And so Condé decided to hire Frank on as the editor for Vanity Fair on a handshake. He did his best deals on a handshake. They had one competitor at the time. H.L. Mencken was the editor, and it was the Smart Set, where they said, one civilized reader is worth 1,000 boneheads. Well, Smart Set eventually went out of business, but they had a very friendly rivalry between them. And as a matter of fact, George Jean Nathan, who had worked at the Smart Set, ended up working at Vanity Fair after it closed. Condé believed in hiring the best people, no matter what. It didn't matter whether they were gay, lesbian, Jewish, Catholic, whatever, black, it didn't matter. What mattered was talent. It didn't matter if they were known. So he hired a girl called Dorothy Rothschild to write captions for Vogue. The one that caught Frank Croninshield's eye was "Brevity is the soul of lingerie." She kept dropping little poems on Frank's desk to try and transfer over from little old Vogue into Vanity Fair. Finally, he agreed to take her on. He then also wanted to take on somebody to make the Vanity Fair articles more substantial, so he brought on the chap in the middle, a guy called Robert Benchley, who was actually one of the funniest people I've ever read about, and I've read his own biography, and it's absolutely hysterical. But Robert Benchley was a Harvard graduate. He had been the editor of the Harvard Lampoon, and he got the job because it was going to get all very serious. I opened the book with one of the incidents that happened while they were working there. Benchley, by the way, went on to win an Oscar for a short that was produced by MGM, called How to Sleep. And it is hysterically funny if you can ever get a hold of it. Dorothy, of course, would eventually go on to other things. But the third person in the picture is a gentleman called Robert Sherwood, who was about 6'8". He was fresh out of the army in 1919 and came to work. He said he was a very good writer. Frank wanted to believe him. He had been very wounded during the war. He'd been gassed. He'd been shot in the legs. And as Dorothy would say, how did they miss his heart? You know, I mean, the guy was enormous. Sherwood would go on, actually, to win 4 Pulitzer Prizes and become the speechwriter for FDR. So these were all unknowns, but they all misbehaved tremendously. And, of course, ended up getting fired. Yeah, well, it was all basically because Dorothy decided that, as theater critic by now, that she was going to go after Broadway producers, and she ended up libeling them, and so he really had no choice. Condé didn't really want to fire her, but knew she had to go, and it was poor Frank who had to do it. So, during the war, he sets up British Vogue because he can't export paper from America, believe it or not, during World War I, and decides at the end of the war in 1919 that he's going to go across to Europe and set up a French Vogue. So he's now become the first international magazine publisher in the world. Now, we talked about a few of the staff writers. I'm just going to show you a few pictures because, of course, that's what magazines are all about, right? His #1 photographer was Adolphe de Meyer on the left here. It was in 1915, after he lost the first battle, after Hearst lost the first battle with Conde Nast, that he decided that he was going to poach de Meyer. It was a loss, but only for about 10 minutes because George Hoene is how he pronounced his name, but it's probably Hoon, replaced him. And it was George who took the first pictures of movement. He was followed by Edward Steichen, and of course, Cecil Beaton later on. And then there was the discovery of the model turned photographer, Lee Miller. Now, Lee Miller actually was Vogue's war photographer during the Second World War. We'll come back on to her pictures in a minute. So this is an example of the type of picture that Adolphe de Meyer took. It's very nice. It's actually Mary Pickford's wedding dress to Douglas Fairbanks Sr., and it's Condé's daughter, Natika, who's modeling it. It was apparently so small, nobody but a child could fit into it. This is a lady called Grace Moore, who was the Met's soprano. She also became Condé's mistress by 1919 when his marriage to Clarice finally broke up. The picture is one of Hoon's pictures, and it shows that now they're starting to play with shadows and light in a way that's more akin to what we were used to today. But Steichen is the one who created the celebrity photograph. Here we have Gloria Swanson and Charlie Chaplin, Adele and Fred Astaire, Noel Coward, who, by the way, Condé saved from starvation, giving him his first $10 when he came to America in the 1920s, Greta Garbo. And this is Cecil Beaton's specialty. He used to make people of a certain weight thin. And here's how he managed to change Helena Rubinstein from a rather portly lady into somebody who was quite beautiful. But then again, Cecil Beaton was also very friendly with the British aristocracy, and when it came time for the abdication of Edward VIII to marry Wallis Simpson, it was Beaton who took the pictures of her trousseau. Of course, the trousseau was made by the designer Mainbacher, who also happened to be a Condé Nast employee. The only ugly pictures to ever appear in Vogue were these taken by Lee Miller. And on the left is a picture of Lee in Hitler's bath. On the right is what happened when she walked into one of the huts at Dachau. I mentioned that he hired lots of people, lots of writers, lots of everything. People as diverse as F. Scott Fitzgerald, P.G. Wodehouse, and believe it or not, Jack Dempsey. All these people wrote for him. So what mattered was the diversity, the fact that people had something special to give to the reader. The artists were incredible. This is Benito, Eduardo Benito, one of his famous covers. Here we have Carl Erickson with one of his more beautiful, just very light touches for one of the models that he drew. Now I'm going to say Miguel Covarrubias. I always get his name wrong, but you know who I mean. He did some of the more fanciful Vogue covers. Now, the other thing that happened with the photography in Vogue in particular was that you never doubted what any picture was trying to sell you. So here we have sandals, hats. We also have Marlene Dietrich, who's modeling a hat. More hats. If you want to buy any kind of cosmetics, you of course have to have the gold compact and the jewelry to go with it, don't you? And the covers. It was not unusual to see black people on the covers of Vogue in the 1930s. You always knew what every issue was going to sell you. And then there came a fresh face to Vogue. Carmel White, as she was at the time, Carmel Snow, as she became when she married Palin Snow, who was one of the 400. She arrived and she was a complete breath of fresh air, completely untrained, just like Edna had been in the beginning. Her only claim to fame was that her brother worked for William Randolph Hearst. Now, little did Condé know that that would actually mean something in several years hence. But Carmel's husband was very much into sport, and she was also very much into the idea that women could do anything and go anywhere and be anything. And so the covers became more exotic. You had women who were actually doing sport, who were riding camels, who were shooting, who were going on skiing, who were boating, who were doing all kinds of activities. But he never forgot his core business, which was selling clothing and fashion to women. So you can look at the cover and you know they're trying to sell me jewelry. Here we have the beginning of the Paris season, the beginning of the New York season. Everything was done with a purpose so that the customer and the reader always knew what they were getting. The advertiser always knew that they were advertising in an issue that meant something to the people. And meanwhile, Condé's friendship with Frank Crowninshield blossomed. They were really like brothers. There were a lot of rumors that they were gay. I don't know about Frank one way or the other. I know Edmund Wilson, who was one of the editors at Vanity Fair for a very brief period of time, believed that he was a eunuch. I prefer to call him a confirmed bachelor. Condé, on the other hand, loved women. And he was always seen with a pretty woman on his arm after he and Clarice split up. It took many years for her to agree to a divorce, but that's for something in the future. In the meantime, in the 1920s, Clarice moved to 1000 Park Avenue. Their daughter, Natika, became the hostess at many of Condé's famous parties. And of course, Condé moved to 1040 Park, and Elsie de Wolfe is the person who decorated the apartment. That's where the most famous Café Society parties took place. I like to say, think of Mrs. Astor dancing with Groucho Marx. I can't imagine Groucho Marx dancing, but anyway, that's the sort of thing, is anybody who was in the news, anybody who was a trendsetter was allowed into the party or invited to the parties. Frequently, they didn't even know Condé to begin with. That was the case with Charles Lindbergh, as an example. He'd just returned from his solar flight over to France, and Condé decided to throw a party in his honor, and he came. He was mobbed, but he came. Natika ended up having to rescue him, but that's a whole other story. But this is the apartment, the famous apartment, frequently a backdrop in Vanity Fair, and at times, too, in Vogue. I apologize for the quality of the pictures. These are pictures of pictures in the family albums. But it gives you an idea of what it was like. On the right-hand side there, you've got the ballroom. And these were actual shots that appeared in various Vogue or Vanity Fair magazines. And guess what happens? Suddenly, in 1925, a guy called Harold Ross decides to come up with something called the New Yorker. So they get worried about Vanity Fair, but it turns out that they decided to work with Harold Ross. Now, when I say that Condé was the first to think of a lot of things, he was a pioneer in all new technologies, and he had the best printing plant in the entire United States in Greenwich, Connecticut. And they did a deal with the New Yorker to print the New Yorker at Condé's printing plant. And basically, it was a very successful relationship for many years. It was only once the Newhouses bought the New Yorker that the two magazines were part of the Conde Nast publications. So as you can see, they also have very stylish artists. And this is Natika in 1928, 29, when she was still the hostess in the main for Condé. She introduced him to this man on the right, a chap called Iva Petrevich, who was a white Russian who had come over to the States. He started out as a runner on Wall Street. It was always very fashionable, very debonair, and Natika insisted with her father, "You will love this man, he's just like you." And he said, "Well, why is he just like me?" It's just, he thinks in numbers. He sees numbers as pictures. He understands how important it is to have a balance sheet that works, to have all of the covers that work, to understand what covers are attracting people, which ones don't attract people. I promise you, Dad, he's a great guy. They met, they liked each other, but Condé was thinking about something else. He had fallen in love with a woman the same age as his daughter, Leslie Foster. Now, the picture on the lower right is Leslie, who's facing us, and that is Natika talking to her. He was afraid that people would make fun of them. She was afraid people would make fun of them. They were a real generation apart. But at the end of the day, they truly, truly loved each other, and they got married right before the crash. This is a picture of them on honeymoon. As a matter of fact, he was so nervous that he invited all of his children to join them on honeymoon, and also Petrevich. So he agreed to hire Petrevich because he was thinking in terms of the future. I need somebody who's reliable, who can take over from me. Sorry about this. This is a really bad shot. I apologize. That's the house that they bought together on Long Island at Sands Point. That's the sunroom that overlooks the Sound. And within the first year, Leslie gave birth to her daughter, little Leslie, who is one of the main people who helped me on this book. Little Leslie is 89 today. So these two sly guys here, they look like bankers, don't they? Well, they are. The chap on the left is Waddell Catchings. Some of you may have heard of him, some not. The chap on the right is Harrison Williams. Harrison Williams owned the largest power generation company in the United States. Catchings was the chairman of Goldman Sachs. And together they decided in 1928 that they were going to start telling people whose companies they wanted to acquire once the crash came, that they should load themselves up with debt. And the one thing that Condé always believed in is you go to the experts, let the experts advise you, and yes, in the end of the day, it's your decision, but you'll have to trust the experts. And these men were his friends, and he trusted them. And they loaded him up with too much debt, so that when the crash came, Condé was worthless. And Condé Nast Publications was actually taken over by them. And they tried to get Condé out of the company. And they might have succeeded if it hadn't have been for Edna Woolman Chase, because they wanted to make her in charge of the company. And she said not only would she not take the job, but she would quit, and she would make sure that all the staff would quit as well. And so Condé was left in place, but he had to find somebody to help him out with the debt. Fortunately, these guys overreached themselves, and they were taken over by Floyd Odlum, who basically put the Condé Nast publications back on more of a level footing, but he also said, I will sell to anybody who wants to buy this so I can make a profit. Well, by now, Condé's really getting upset. He approached Joe Kennedy to buy it, because Joe had offered to buy the Hearst publications, which were also in trouble, and Joe said no. He asked his good friend Bernard Baruch. He said no. Everybody in America said no. And at exactly the same time, good old Carmel Snow decides she's going to defect to Harper's Bazaar, which of course was a terrible blow to Condé. And he never forgave her, never. And she's the only person who did him wrong who he never forgave. But as you can see, there's a very famous New Yorker, Diana Vriedland, who's at Harper's Bazaar talking to Carmel Snow. By now, Carmel's brother, Tom White, is a general manager of all the Hearst companies, and he's one of 7 people who's bailing out Hearst at the same time. As if that weren't bad enough, he gets prostate cancer and has a heart attack. He has a radical prostatectomy. It's a hard word to say, I'm sorry. I'll get off that slide. Basically is in such poor health, he doesn't know what he's going to do. And there's this lady who he meets at a cocktail party. He's still married to Leslie, but by now he's trying to decide if he's prepared to ruin this young woman's life. She won't be able to have any more children with him. He's not quite sure what he's going to do about it. And this lady comes into his life. Does anybody know who she is? Clare Boothe Luce. At the time, she was Clare Boothe Brokaw. And Condé met her at a cocktail party, as frequently the case. He says, go meet Mrs. Chase. She meets Mrs. Chase. Mrs. Chase says, well, I'm off to Europe for the summer. Come back in September, and I'll see if I can hire you. Clare, being Clare, did the most amazing thing I have ever seen, ever. She decided, since Condé was away and since Edna was away, she would, as she put it, ooze her way into Vogue. What does that mean? She reported for work and claimed she was the new girl. And actually, suddenly there was stuff on her desk, and she started work, and by the time Edna came back, it was too late to fire her. So she went from that to becoming the managing director of Vanity Fair eventually, but all within 3 years. Now, there were lots and lots of rumors that Condé was enamored with her and he was going to leave his wife for her and everything else. Frankly, that's a lot of hokum. And she wouldn't have married Condé anyway. But Condé decides very painfully to tell his wife Leslie she has to go and marry somebody else. And he had arranged for her to meet this gentleman, Rex Benson, who was a banker, Kleinwort Benson in England. And they did fall in love and they did get married. But as Rex's children said to me, Leslie and Condé remained entirely devoted to each other for the rest of his life. They had 2 children together, and of course, they were very happy. Condé kept little Leslie, in New York with him so she could go to an American school. Obviously, it was very difficult for Big Leslie, as they called her in the family, to keep Leslie in England at the time. Meanwhile, dear Clare decides she's going to marry Henry Luce. The picture on the left was taken only 4 months before the picture on the right. It was not a happy union. I just put this in for the fun of it because Dorothy Parker was such a breath of fresh air. So yes, on hearing that Clare Boothe Luce was invariably kind to her inferiors, Dorothy said, and where does she find them? Meanwhile, Condé, about 1934, finally finds somebody who's going to bail him out and buy Condé Nast publications from Odlum. It's a gentleman in England called William Barry, Lord Camrose, who owned a variety of women's magazines and also at the time the Daily Telegraph. And the deal that they did was a handshake deal, okay? Nobody was to know that Camrose had bailed him out, and Condé still stayed in charge of all of his magazines. I don't know anywhere today where that would happen. And so Clare is now, by 1936, 32, 34, 35, she's now in charge of Vanity Fair. And she was, of course, a staunch Republican, as some of you may recall. She decides that as the election is coming up in 32, that she's going to start lampooning FDR because, of course, his New Deal is a terrible thing, and FDR is a horrible man. And that didn't really play very well because, naturally, FDR was very popular with the people. And so Vanity Fair subscriptions started to fall off. People weren't buying it as much on the newsstand. And this continued through 1936 election. Finally, what happened, Clare, of course, left when she married Henry Luce, and Helen Brown Norden took over very briefly as its managing director. Condé had a brief affair with her. She wrote about him in her book, Stranger at the Party, but I think he would have been very upset to find out that she was publicizing their sex life, because he was a very quiet, very shy man, and he didn't want his private life to be talked about in public. And this is the cover of the last issue of Vanity Fair in 1936, in February 36. Helen Brown Norden became, of course, Helen Lawrenson, and she went on to write a lot for Esquire and became a sort of biographer for Clare as well. Vanity Fair was subsumed into Vogue, and Frank and Condé were both broken. It was their love affair with New York that had created Vanity Fair, and they were just so upset they were never going to be the same. Now, one of the other things Vanity Fair got wrong is it decided that it would, of course, talk about Mussolini and Hitler, but their predictions for what they were going to be doing to Europe and the world were entirely wrong. And of course, Hitler invades the West in 1939, and by June 1940, they'd taken over Paris. Condé is now an old man in many ways. His heart has been broken by all the strain of trying to save his company. He's had several heart attacks that he's kept secret. He kept secret his prostate condition. Nobody knew anything except only his secretary, his daughter, and his butler. That was it. So now he's faced with a situation where all of the people that he hired in France, whom he loved, many of whom were very close friends, were now in danger. And he brought as many of them to safety as he could. On the right-hand side, he brought over Michel de Brunoff, who was the editor at Vogue. There he's pictured after the war with Lee Miller. On the left was Solange Diane, who was the fashion editor at Vogue. Solange was put into Fresnes concentration camp, but did survive the war. Her husband, who was put into a different concentration camp, did not. But there's a lot in the book about how Condé desperately tried to save people, how he spent any cash that he had in sending care packages to the British as well, including at that point to his former wife. Condé dies in September 1942 of heart failure, essentially. And there's a very touching story that Edna Woolman Chase wrote about those last days with him, which I do include in the book. He died virtually without any money. His first wife, Clarice, had an apartment on East 72nd Street, which Condé had bought for her outright. They worked together for the benefit of the grandchildren, and he was always wonderful to her and very generous. He and Leslie remained very good friends after his death. Frank was the only member of the Vanity Fair team who came out on top. He sold his Conde Nast shares on the eve of, literally on, I think it was September the 8th. right before the stock market crash. So here we have Condé's furniture, all his personal effects, up for auction. And very sadly, even the family had to bid for it at auction. They weren't allowed the smallest trinket. Oh dear, now I've lost my, there it is. Iva Petsevich, who I mentioned before, was named by Condé as the new chief executive of the magazine empire. He wanted to marry Marlene Dietrich. Marlene didn't want him. He was very active in Hollywood. Here he's pictured on the left with some of his good friends, David Niven. You've got James Stewart. He eventually married Clare Boothe Luce in 1963, and they stayed married. And he was cut from the same cloth as Condé. His word was his bond. Whatever, he hired people who he felt were right for the job as opposed to famous. But he too realized that he had to sell the magazine empire when William Barry died. He was given the opportunity to find an American buyer, and he opted for the Newhouse family. So of course, a new era. Iva Petsevich, though, is still in charge of Conde Nast. He brings forward Alex Lieberman, and of course, they poach, to get their own back on the Hearst Empire, Diana Vriedland. Now, here the two of them look very happy. I think this picture characterizes their relationship a lot better, don't you? They didn't get on. She left, Grace Mirabella took over, and of course, after her, we have Tina Brown, who came in to effectively resurrect Vanity Fair in 1984, and she did a great job until 1992. Of course, the lady on the right needs no introduction to New York, even though she is British, I think, still, or partially British. But the one who really made Vanity Fair sing every single song that it used to sing was definitely Graydon Carter. He, again, made Vanity Fair what it had been originally. In other words, it wasn't that you would invite stars to a Vanity Fair party at the Oscars, it's that the stars had to be at the Vanity Fair party at the Oscars or they weren't stars. That's a big difference, and anybody who read Vanity Fair was allowed to go into that world. And he didn't only have movie stars, they wrote a fabulous article about the Gerlich collection, which was what I wrote about for Hitler's Art Thief. They did what I would call important journalism in many different ways. And essentially, here we have their 100th issue, the 100th anniversary issue. Never mind the 50 years it wasn't in publication, okay? But that's what Vanity Fair was all about. And Conde Nast was a very shy man from very modest beginnings who actually brought business ethics to America, America's can-do attitude to Europe, and European style to New York. Thank you. So, any questions? Go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, please wait for the microphone to be passed to you for your question so we can record it. And make sure to speak clearly and directly into the microphone. Thank you.
Oh, come on, somebody must have a question. Oh, gentleman here.
Who currently has the apartment at 1040, I'm sorry? Oh, who currently has the house on Long Island and the apartment at 1040 Park? Do you know?
I don't know. I asked Leslie, who actually owns the house now at Sands Point, and she didn't know. So, but I can tell you what happened to 1040. It's a very sad story. It was a 32-room duplex apartment with an enclosed balcony all the way around. Magnificent. It could not be sold. And it was eventually, after about 5 years, actually more than that, 1948, it was subdivided back into 3 separate apartments, and no longer duplex. Natika used to go there often with her daughter to paint because it had fantastic light in it. And her daughter used to dance her ballet in the dance floor. That part of it is also in the book. But unfortunately, it didn't remain. It's a pity. Thank you.
In Greenwich, there are 2 very beautiful granite stone pillars where I assume the printing plant was.
Yes.
Who owns those pillars? Is it the city of Greenwich or town of Greenwich, or is it a private property?
I believe that the town of Greenwich has asked for them to remain in place, and they've taken over the care and maintenance. Essentially, the printing plant, which was the most extraordinary place, it was, I think, 400 acres originally, that had been scrubland, and they turned it into the most beautiful park. And they were printing for about 25 of America's most important magazines at the time. It was sold after the Newhouses bought Condé Nast Publications, and I'm pleased that it was after Condé's life, because it would have been a tremendous sadness to him. It probably would have killed him if Vanity Fair hadn't have gone a long way towards that already. But I'm almost certain that it's the city, the town of Greenwich that owns them.
Thank you. They're very beautiful, and they are maintained.
They are gorgeous, yes.
Thank you. What is one of the stories that you heard that most surprised you in your research for the book?
I think that it was the story about Leslie and Condé and why they decided to divorce. I had a bizarre connection with the Bensons, the Benson side of the family. My husband worked for many years for Kleinwort Benson as a banker. We gave up banking, by the way, investment banking in 2005, okay? So we weren't part of the bad stuff. So anyway, I knew about him, and I knew that he was quite a swashbuckling character. Unfortunately, what was so good is that Leslie's half-brothers, Robin and David, gave me access to their father's diary about when he had met Leslie and how he was afraid that he was falling in love with a married woman, and she was afraid she might be falling in love with him. But they hadn't actually realized that Condé had sent her over to England to meet him on purpose. And they always say if you love somebody a lot, you have to be willing to let them go. In Condé's case, he not only was willing to let her go, but he felt that that was the only way she could have a life. He was afraid that she had married an old man. Yes, they loved each other, but frankly, it wasn't a good life for her. She needed to have a different life. And it was his selflessness, on top of the fact that he was this terribly ethical person, that made me say, oh, I wish I had known him. There's so few people around like that. It would have been lovely to have actually met him. But meeting his children and his grandchildren and great-grandchildren has been my solace, I suppose. Thank you. This lady here in the front. Can you please stand? Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the new houses, what they are doing with Conde Nast?
I don't know, did everybody hear the question? Okay, she asked if I could tell us a little bit more about the new houses and what they're doing with Conde Nast. The very short answer is no. Simply because when I was being vetted by Condé Nast, as to whether or not I was a fit person to go into their archive, they asked me one question: who are you writing about? And I said, Condé Nast. are you going to be writing about anybody who's living? And at the time, Cy Newhouse was still alive. And I said, no, I like writing about dead people. So I specifically stayed away from the Newhouses, obviously because I think people didn't want to just have the story end with the sadness of Condé dying. It was important you understood that in the book that the empire lived on. There are an awful lot of changes at Conde Nast and at all the Newhouse publications. Obviously, the world is spinning at such a rate right now that print magazines are difficult for people to make any kind of a profit on. But when you're a privately held company like Advanced Publications is, it's very difficult for anybody outside to understand. There were lots of rumors around Graydon Carter's quitting when he did. There have been huge changes in personnel. I think what they're trying to do is very simply make it profitable and keep all of the magazines in print as well as online. Whether they'll succeed, I don't know. It's a bewildering world in media right now. And I think if Condé were alive today, he would be totally beside himself. Okay? Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Last question.
At the peak of his empire, what was the publication? What were the publication numbers in terms of readership and buying?
Okay, this is, at the peak of the empire, it was probably around 5 million. But you have to understand that in that 5 million, you've got offices that had them out on their tables when people were in the waiting rooms, your doctor's offices and what have you. So you would probably multiply that by 5. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Susan? Yes. Before, could I ask you all just to keep to your seat just for a little bit longer? Susan, thank you so much for that fascinating insight into Condé Nast the man and Condé Nast the empire. It was absolutely engrossing, and I feel like we were immersed in café society. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
On the occasion like this, we would like to make a presentation to you, and to do so is our Executive Director, Victoria Dengel.
Thank you.
And I join it also in saying it was so thoughtfully put together, and we all can't wait to read the book, and thank you for your very thorough research, and for really, you could tell you really loved your characters. So. On behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to Susan Ronald, author of Conde Nast, The Man and His Empire, for her participation in the General Society Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. So on behalf of the Society, thank you. And because, Susan, we could already tell there's another book inside of you, we've made you a lifetime member to our library, whose archives go back to 1785. And we also have New York Times bestsellers, so I'm sure you'll find something. So come back.
Since you say that, the next book is about somebody else who's also known in America. I've gone back to the dark side. Sorry. It's called The Ambassador, and it's about Joseph P. Kennedy as ambassador to Britain, 1938 to 1940.
We look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming this evening. I want to remind you that this book is for sale, and Susan would be happy to autograph it. And I hope you'll also join us now for a glass of wine, and I'm sure Susan will be happy to answer more questions. Thank you so much for coming this evening.